Welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to dive into this one with you. So look, for decades, whenever the world talked about Africa, the conversation almost inevitably leaned towards foreign aid or humanitarian challenges, right? But the hard data tells a completely different and frankly, massive story. We are looking at a literal multi-trillion-dollar investment opportunity that is unfolding as we speak. It's being driven by massive structural reforms, regional integration, and a huge demographic boom. Today, we're going to look closely at the facts, the figures, and the real structural shifts happening on the continent right now.
Let's kick things off by throwing out a staggeringly large number, $100 trillion. According to the African Development Bank, that is the amount of excess capital currently managed by institutional investors and commercial banks globally. Think about that. These funds are just sitting in advanced economies desperately hunting for yield, trying to find a solid return on investment. And yet, at the exact same time, the world's highest growth market, Africa, is actively seeking capital to build out its infrastructure. Honestly, it's one of the greatest economic paradoxes of our time.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's exactly how we're going to unpack this economic paradigm shift. 1. The $100 trillion global paradox. 2. AFCFTA, the game changer. 3. Bridging the infrastructure gap. 4. The $4.4 trillion domestic engine. 5. Lessons from China's miracle. And finally, 6. Seizing the opportunity.
All right, starting off with Section 1, the $100 trillion global paradox, matching global capital with African growth. Like we just touched on, we have this massive global mismatch. On one side of the globe, advanced economies are suffering from slow growth. They've got an abundance of excess savings, but very few places to invest it for high returns. On the other side of the globe, we have Africa. It's a booming market, a rapidly expanding middle class, and there's a desperate need for productive infrastructure financing. This should absolutely be a mutually profitable transaction, right? A perfect match of supply and demand.
Now, we really need to completely bust this outdated stigma that investing in Africa is somehow purely exotic or risky. It's just not true. Take a look at this hard data from Moody's Analytics. Africa's cumulative 10-year infrastructure debt default rate is just 1.9%. Let that sink in for a second. That makes it literally the second lowest default rate in the entire world, right behind the Middle East. So that whole perception of massive risk, it's vastly overstated compared to the actual measurable reality.
So it completely begs this crucial question. If the default rates are really that low and global capital is so abundant, why isn't this mutually profitable transaction happening at the scale it should be? Well, the answer historically lies in fragmented markets, an over-reliance on exporting raw materials, and honestly, a lack of properly structured, bankable projects. But, as you're about to see, the structural solutions to these exact bottlenecks are happening on the continent right now.
Which brings us right to Section 2, AFCFTA, the game changer, unlocking a unified market. This is the ultimate catalyst that is transforming 54 fragmented nations into one massive economic juggernaut. Just look at the sheer scale of Africa's combined power under this agreement. We are talking about a unified market of 1.3 billion people. That makes it the largest free trade area in the world by population, hands down. It combines a gross domestic product of roughly $3.4 trillion. And by wiping out bilateral tariffs and non-tariff barriers, the World Bank actually estimates the AFCFTA could boost Africa's total income by a staggering $450 billion by 2035. This fundamentally rewrites the math for investors. You aren't investing in a single isolated nation anymore. You're tapping into a massive, integrated regional value chain that is completely primed for rapid industrialization.
But for a massive free trade area to actually work, goods, services, and data need to be able to move. That brings us to Section 3, bridging the infrastructure gap, deficits as business opportunities.
Historically, the African Development Bank estimated a need for $130 to $170 billion annually for infrastructure. People have often framed this negatively, like it's a deficit. But let's flip the script. In reality, these are highly lucrative, untapped business opportunities. Closing the gap across power, water, health, and broadband, that's not about charity, it's about tremendous investment returns. Take health, for example. With Africa's growing middle class, the UN Economic Commission for Africa estimates that health business opportunities will be worth as much as $259 billion by 2030. No way, right? Or consider the digital divide. To hit universal broadband access over the next decade, we're looking at a $100 billion need, with a third of that dedicated purely to hard infrastructure like fiber optic cables and 4G base stations.
And the opportunity in energy is just immense. Right now, about 565 million Africans still do not have access to reliable electricity. Fixing that supply requires an investment of around $120 billion a year through 2040. And renewables are the real superstar here. Did you know Africa holds over half of the world's renewable energy potential? It's crazy. Investing in solar power generation isn't just about meeting climate commitments. As sovereign wealth funds are figuring out, it's just a highly cost-effective way to literally power the economic activity the continent is generating.
Now, get ready for the major twist of this explainer. If you thought Africa was just sitting around waiting for foreign money to build all of this, think again. Let's look at Section 4, the $4.4 trillion domestic engine. Africa funding Africa. $4.4 trillion. This is our second anchor number for today, and it represents the sheer scale of Africa's own investable domestic capital base, as recently identified by the Africa Finance Corporation, or AFC. Africa already possesses massive, completely untapped domestic capital ready to be deployed into its own development.
So the crucial point is, where exactly does all this wealth actually sit? Well, it's highly tangible. Roughly $2.5 trillion is held in African banks. There's well over $1 trillion sitting in pension and insurance assets. And that's growing incredibly fast as more people enter the social security net. Then add in over $450 billion in foreign reserves and $180 billion in sovereign wealth funds. The capital is absolutely there. The real key here is regulatory reform to unlock it. For example, Nigeria totally revamped its pension regulations and now allocates 15% for infrastructure bonds and 5% for infrastructure equity. That right there is a game-changing model for turning domestic savings directly into domestic growth.
We're also seeing a huge shift taking place with domestic sovereign wealth funds. Look, because individual African sovereign wealth funds are relatively small compared to the global giants, they're increasingly collaborating. They're pooling their resources to develop massive cross-border regional projects. Why? Because pooling their capital makes these projects large enough and de-risk enough to attract those major international investors from places like London or Dubai. They're basically providing the anchor capital to draw in the rest of the world.
To really grasp how fast this combination of domestic focus and smart infrastructure can transform an economy, we got to look at history. Section 5, Lessons from China's Miracle, a tale of two fates. A Nigerian scholar, Samuel Udo, recently presented this fascinating historical parallel that proves rapid, transformative growth is entirely possible with the right policies.
Just consider this stark historical contrast from 1980. Back then, Lagos, Nigeria was booming on petrodollars, boasting a GDP per capita of over $1,100. It felt rich. Meanwhile, Shanghai, China in 1980, it had a GDP per capita of just $195. The Pudong district was literally farmland. The streets were just filled with bicycles. But Lagos kind of mistook consumer-driven resource export prosperity for real development. China, on the flip side, chose the much more arduous path of deeply cultivating its industrial productivity. Fast forward to today, and the economic realities of those two cities are completely reversed.
Udo points out that Africa can absolutely emulate some highly pragmatic steps from China's blueprint to leapfrog from a resource-dependent economy straight into a modern industrial system. Step 1, establish special economic zones to test out policies and create stable business environments. Step 2, heavily prioritize STEM education. As he puts it, and I love this, infrastructure is the skeleton, but human capital is the lifeblood. And step 3, leverage that massive market size to explicitly exchange market access for actual technology transfer.
All right, so we've got the global capital, we've got the domestic African capital, and we have the historical blueprint for success. That brings us to Section 6, seizing the opportunity, building the future now. How can all this capital actually be safely and effectively deployed right now?
Well, today, innovative vehicles are actively mobilizing capital to bridge this financing gap. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Institutions like Africa 50 are pioneering the use of blended finance, which basically means mixing concessional funds, like grants, with commercial private capital. That lowers the risk and pulls in as much private capital as possible. Furthermore, well-structured public-private partnerships, or PPPs, are giving private investors the regulatory comfort and the quality off-takers that they absolutely require before jumping in.
You can really feel this fierce urgency and determination among African leaders to use their local resources to build lasting prosperity. Samaila Zubairu, the CEO of the Africa Finance Corporation, hit the nail on the head. He powerfully stated, "We must take that decision to build our future now, not later. It means a decision not to export our jobs and import inflation." That is so key. By funding its own infrastructure and processing its own minerals, rather than just shipping off raw materials, Africa is completely setting the stage to become the industrial powerhouse of the future.
Which brings us to a final, provocative thought I want to leave you with today. We know Africa has $4.4 trillion of its own capital ready to mobilize. We know the free trade area is active. We know the default rates are incredibly low. The continent is on the move, building its industrial base and retaining its economic value. So the question isn't really whether Africa will grow. The real question is, will global capital remain sitting on the sidelines, trapped by totally outdated perceptions, and completely miss out on the greatest growth story of the 21st century? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.